Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Israel Matters. Once again, it's midweek. Starting next week, we will be back to doing this on Sunday. But of course, yesterday we had Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most serious day, I should say. I don't know what to call it. It's not a sad day, but it is kind of a happy day, wouldn't you think, Elliot?
Yeah, it's a day of contemplation.
A serious day,
Yeah,
a somber day.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted to share a thought with you. Most years on Yom Kippur, we spend the entire day in the synagogue. And because of the coronavirus this year and limitations on gatherings, there was a lot more being done on our own. And there was a downside to it. A lot of people liked the fact that they didn't have to spend all day in the synagogue. It's a
Yes.
difficult day. I personally love Yom Kippur. People think I'm nuts because you're fasting and you're praying all day, but I actually find it a very inspiring experience, and I really do enjoy it. And I'm not just saying that. Like, if you ask my kids, what's your dad's favorite day of the year, they would probably roll their eyes and say, "You're not going to believe this, Yom Kippur." I actually really do. I find the entire build up to it, and then the entire build up within it leads to this sense of the spiritual space that we're in towards the end of it. The combination of the fasting and the praying and the disconnection from the physical world that we have, that it really gets me into a kind of different mental space and very spiritually tuned in. And I didn't have that experience quite the same way this year. It was a bit difficult, but it got me thinking about some other things. First, just a word about fasting. I think there's a very simple understanding of fasting, and many of our viewers who are not Jewish do still engage in fasting. A lot of Christians take on fasts for various reasons, for repentance and atonement. And I just wanted to share a very quick, simple idea. Just like last week, I shared a quick, simple idea about the shofar, a quick, simple idea about what we're doing when we're fasting. Because we're not just doing this to make ourselves hungry or to cause ourselves to suffer, but it's very simple. We're constantly battling within ourselves between the primacy of our body and the primacy of our spirit. And it's a constant battle. We have this every day. Is my main identity my body, and my spirit is kind of there to support my body or to give it some meaning? Or is my main identity my spirit, and my body is kind of this car I'm driving, or this thing this garment that my soul is wearing? And it's a constant battle. Which one do we identify with more? And a very simple thing we're doing when we're fasting is we're essentially saying to the bodily needs, to the body, you're not in charge. Today, we're not going to pay attention to you. Today, I'm going to identify wholly, entirely with my spirit, with my soul. And that's why our restrictions are not just not eating. We don't bathe. We don't engage in sexual relations. In other words, the needs of the body are not being paid attention to. Now, that's not an ideal state. God does not want us to slit our wrists and disconnect from the physical world. But it has an instructive and kind of, I should say, spiritually therapeutic effect in reminding the body that the priority is the soul. So basically, the soul decides when we're going to eat. The soul decides, not the body. The body's not in control. And that itself we're supposed to take that with us into all of the enjoyment of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles that follows, which in historical times, when it was a more agrarian society in this part of the world, this was the time of greatest material plenty. It's the end of the harvest season. People were at their wealthiest. And they're essentially being reminded that the spirit comes first. So that's basically what fasting is all about. I just want to share that. Something to think about when we're fasting. We're not just trying to torture ourselves. But the thought that I had for you, and we even chatted a little bit last night right after Yom Kippur ended, was I was sitting back and I was thinking about Yom Kippur and the fact that, you go back 47 years and a war broke out on Yom Kippur,
Yes.
that our enemy attacked us. As you know, any of you who've ever been in Israel for Yom Kippur, this country is silent on Yom Kippur. Even Jews who are not generally observant of Jewish law respect Yom Kippur enough that there's really no cars in the streets. There's no activity. It is dead silent. I live in a city, not like Elliot lives in a more rural place, but I live in a city. I live in a busy street corner, and it is just silent in Yom Kippur. And I was thinking about what it must have been like 47 years ago when a war breaks out and our enemies attacked us at that time. And our enemies were formidable. There was a legitimate fear that the state of Israel was in existential peril at the time.
Yes.
And I was thinking about all of this, and I was kind of being grateful, feeling kind of happy about it, saying, wow, look how far we've come. Syria is a non-entity. Egypt is a non-entity. Jordan is at peace with us. So we have Lebanon, which is it's more than a mosquito in our ear. It's a serious problem. Hamas is more of a mosquito in our ear bothering us that we have to control. But I was contemplating the fact that look how far we've come, and I don't have to live in fear of an existential threat on Yom Kippur. And then I started thinking, well, wait a second, am I fooling myself? Is that accurate? I got to talk to Elliot. So I'm throwing that out to you.
And then I ruined your evening.
well, let's hear. Share with everyone how you responded. You gave me some reading material, but I want to know, am I totally off base with that way of thinking?
I don't think it's a question of being totally off base. We're certainly in a different place today than we were then. However, and I think here's the however. There are two phrases that when I hear them, I worry. One is they wouldn't dare, and the other is they can't. Both of those are extremely dangerous concepts, and I can tell you, having studied strategic surprise, among other things, over the course of my career, they wouldn't dare and they can't always precede a surprise attack. Whether it's Pearl Harbor, the German invasion of Russia, Yom Kippur, others, basically belittling the enemy, either by belittling their capability or belittling their intentions, or both. And Israel went even further than that. In 1973, creating an entire theoretical framework that came to be known as the concept, or the conceptia, explaining how they simply weren't going to attack us. Now this had to go on.
Was this because of our success in the 6-Day War?
Yes, you beat my sentence by one. Yeah, no, it'll go very good. Yes, in part, the success of the 6-Day War created what I call two deadly myths. One is that the Arabs are incompetent, and that their incompetence is permanent. In other words, it's inherent. And two is that we're supermen. Our pilots don't even need planes. They just go up there and fly and take everything out. Our guys are absolutely capable of everything. Now, even that was a myth, because aside from the fact that the ideas are myth, nobody considered that over 700 Israeli soldiers were killed in the 6-Day War. 700 in the 6-Day War, which was touted as this great walkover against a bunch of buffoons. And nobody really stopped to analyze, how did the buffoons kill 700 Israeli soldiers in 6 days? And I mean, these are tough questions. Now, when the Yom Kippur War,
that's not a high death toll for a war, but it is for a war that's only 6 days long.
That's my point. Look, I'll give you an interesting analytical point that I know is correct because it's mine, and it was published in context of a paper, so other people apparently agreed with it. One of the measures of intensity of combat, other things being equal, is number of killed per period of time, in this case per day. Okay, so over 100 Israeli soldiers were killed on the average per day of the 6-Day War. Now, if you ask the average Israeli to this day, which war was a more intensive, the 6-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, 99.9% of Israelis will say the Yom Kippur War. However, the Yom Kippur War lasted 21, 22 days, depending on how you count which ceasefire, and 2,400, and again, 2,300, 2,500, depending on how you count casualties, soldiers were killed. So you do the arithmetic. 2,300 over 21, 700 over 6, and you'll see they're statistically insignificant. In other words, the Six-Day War, for all sorts of psychological reasons and contextual reasons, was looked upon as this enormous no-fault victory, which it wasn't. And with that, Israel goes into Yom Kippur 1973, basically saying, they won't attack us, they can't attack us, and if they do, we'll be done with them in less than 6 days, just like we did the last time. Except many, many things had changed along the way, and Israel's caught by surprise. Now, the article that I sent you last night, written by Reserve General Gershon Cohen, appeared in a couple of places. People can look it up. But essentially, he points out, and Gershon is a brilliant analyst. He points out two very important things, I think. The first is that it was very easy to blame the intelligence failure for the disaster of Yom Kippur. Because an intelligence failure is a fluke, and even knowing some of the inside of it, it was more than a fluke. It would, the chief of intelligence lied to the chief of staff. In other words, there was some dirty stuff in there as well. But ultimately, it was an intelligence failure. And intelligence failures happen, and it happened, and there we were. But that's convenient, because what that basically allows for is if we had only known, it would have been different.
Meaning our system is okay, our system is fine.
Right,
but
we were caught by surprise.
We were caught by surprise, and that happens, and don't worry, it's not going to happen again.
Well, right, and even if it does, we're set. Now, again, if your belief is all you need is good intelligence, that leaves all sorts of holes in other places. I'll come back to that in a moment. But coming back to the Yom Kippur War, if you could blame it all on the intelligence failure, and that's what was done essentially, then you can basically say, hey, look, we were fine, we were good, we were caught by surprise, they sucker punched us, it was our fault, but they had a good stratagem and they played it well. And as soon as we realized what was happening, we got going and we beat them, except that's not the case. And here, let me start by saying that the guys on the ground, as usual, fought amazingly well. In other words, the troops in the field, and I'm going up to even battalion and brigade command, in other words, the lieutenant colonels and colonels who were in the field, with a few exceptions, there are always exceptions, but as a class, fought like lions. They did incredible things. They fought impossible odds. They held out. They stood in places where no army in the world would have stood. But, and here's the but, the reserve call-up was a disaster. And that's not explained by surprise, because a reserve call-up should be prepared for a surprise. The logistical system was a disaster. That can't be explained by surprise. Logistical system should be ready for everything at any time. Orders weren't followed. There were plans in place. The Air Force didn't do what it was supposed to do. Again, the pilots were amazing. The command level didn't execute. The doctrine was poor, especially in Sinai. Gershon Cohen makes a point of this. Ariel Sharon, the war broke out on Shabbat, Yom Kippur, October 6th. On Monday, Ariel Sharon, who incidentally, in my opinion, you can say whatever you want about his politics or his personality, a world-class military genius, historical military genius, gets his reserve division in the field within 2 days, which was astounding, but in part because his division was ready to go to war. Except they weren't ready to fight the war that the Egyptians were bringing to them. Now, is it his fault? Partially, but it's partially the fault of an overall doctrine that didn't change its position from 1967 to 73. And he launches this attack on Monday and gets massacred. The Egyptian forces are heavily equipped with anti-tank missiles. This was known. It was not accounted for in doctrine, and he loses a huge number of tanks in this counterattack. And
they were trying to fight the 6-Day War again.
Yes, but from the wrong place. Okay, the reason the 6-Day War was fought the way it was fought, one of the reasons, is that Israel had no room to maneuver. The Israel of 1967 is tiny. The Israel of 1973 tactically is large, especially in the south because of Sinai. Okay, though the battles under the circumstances should not have been fought along the Suez Canal. Israel had 135 miles of desert to drop back into, absorb the Egyptian attack, mass its forces, and beat the heck out of them, which it, by the way, ultimately did 2 weeks later. But taking losses here also, to be fair, the Army had a very, very sharp learning curve. The Army, the Air Force had a very sharp learning curve, didn't make the same mistakes 2 weeks later. But the first mistakes were avoidable. Now, some things in war are not avoidable, but the first mistakes were avoidable.
Well, what changed on the Egyptian side? Why, what did we miss?
Okay, so first of all, the Russians helped them tremendously. Second, they accepted their weaknesses, and I'll give you just one example, but they accepted their weaknesses and they played into their own whatever strengths they had without trying to push their weaknesses. So it's kind of an interesting back and forth. One of the lessons of the 6-Day War was that if you have air superiority, you have battlefield superiority. That we knocked out their air forces on the first couple of days, and the Israeli Air Force controlled the skies. And we then developed a principle, part of the concept, that said, the Arabs will not attack without air superiority. As long as we have air superiority, they will not attack us. The Egyptians and Syrians split the difference. They said, we don't need air superiority. All we need to do is deny the Israelis air superiority over the battlefield. And they did that with missiles and anti-aircraft guns rather than with their air force. So what they basically said is you can have superiority everywhere in the Middle East except over the battlefield. And we knew that they had moved missiles into the theater. We knew that already in 69, 70. We knew they were getting Russian equipment. But we didn't put two and two together. And we didn't think forward saying, okay, what is the minimum they need, not the maximum? And they operated on the minimum. Our Air Force, every time it engaged their planes, blew them out of the sky. But it couldn't engage on the ground. And that's where it was needed. So I can give you other examples, but it was a change in concept. And by the way, using the missiles and guns required much lower skill training than bringing their pilots up to a level to be able to engage Israeli pilots. Okay, so to give you a modern analogy, Hezbollah's rockets or even Hamas's rockets are dumb. They're not trying to beat us at our technological level. They're trying to beat us below our technological level. They can't match technology for technology, let's say the Iron Dome. So they use kites and balloons. All right, that's a way,
or in Hezbollah's case, in terms of their battle plan, they'll use volume.
Or volume, correct. Right. In other words, they've built their system around their capabilities in a way that avoids the teeth, if you will, of our capability. The complacency is back. Now, let me go back one step. And by the way, I need to say this. People who know me well enough to know I am not an IDF basher. This is not about the IDF is a terrible army and it doesn't know what it's doing and that sort of thing. I'm an officer in the IDF. I'm still in the reserves. proud of it. It's not about that. But being accurate in assessment is also very important. One of the, call it perennial, chronic, historical weaknesses of the IDF is the youth of its officer corps. Now, this started from necessity in 1948. And let's remember that the Israeli army that won in 1948 was a thoroughly, totally unprofessional army. It was a militia, and it was a conglomerate of a number of militias. And it was made up of whoever they could get in. They had Holocaust survivors getting off the boat, and they were putting them on trucks and throwing them into the battlefield. There were a few officers who came from Allied armies of World War II, most of them Jewish, not all of them. Mickey Marcus being one of the more famous ones, but certainly not the only one. From the US Army, he had been a colonel and was killed here during the war, during 1948. But the average officer, and I'm talking about all the way up through colonel and even general, had no real military experience. Maybe they served as soldiers. And here I can tell you, somebody who serves as a private or corporal or even a sergeant has absolutely no idea what's happening at the colonel and general level. It's two different worlds. When Moshe Dayan was chief of staff in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, he instituted a policy based on his experience in 1948 that officers should move up quickly and retire young. Being an officer in the Army is not a career. It's a first step to your real career, which starts afterwards.
That's still true today.
Exactly. Ben-Gurion opposed it, but was not willing to overrule Dayan. Now, back in the day, generals were retiring from the Israeli army at age 42, 43. They were putting in 25 years from age 18 and retiring. Now, I'm sorry, you know what? Yoni Netanyahu was a lieutenant colonel at 27. You shouldn't be a lieutenant colonel when you're 27. The result of it is a deep military professionalization of the officer corps.
Wow. So this is still the case today.
Yes, it is. It's not as bad.
Are there any voices? Are there any voices on the inside at the leadership level that recognize this as a problem?
No, not on the inside. On the outside there are, but not on the inside. Okay, some of it has to do with the conscript system. Look, when an American officer goes into the military, he or she is either a graduate of an academy like West Point or ROTC. In other words, they've got a college degree and they're 22 years old. An Israeli goes to officer school when he's 19, he or she is 19, maybe 20. Those 2 years are huge because the person who's graduated, they've not only graduated college, and we know college isn't all it's cracked up to be, but they've also taken, whether it's in the academy or ROTC, they have taken college level military courses. They have a much deeper sense of what they're doing, and it continues as they rise up into the system. We have 22, 23-year-old captains who haven't gone to college. We've had chiefs of staff who never went to college. It's not the case anymore, but it was the case. When you're running a system this big, you need more than talent. And here I'll tell you, one thing that the Israeli military does amazingly well is personnel selection. In other words, the men and women who are doing the jobs are outstanding individuals.
They're very good at identifying talent and getting it into the right place.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you well know, talent will cover a multitude of sins, but only up to a point.
So this means that very high-ranking officers in the Israeli army don't have that scope of seeing multiple generations of transition in our enemies. And one
Correct.
of the things that I got out of the article you sent me, obviously we're kind of talking about something that our viewers haven't read. I'll put a link in the description of this video to that article by Gershon Cohen.
Put up. I'll send you the basic link. It's a shorter version.
Okay, good. Is that one of the things that we have to pay attention to, and I think this is part of the complacency that I was feeling yesterday on Yom Kippur, is that the motivations of our enemies can shift and change as well. Meaning, like right now in Lebanon, there's a major crisis going on, and we haven't spoken about it yet. I think we should in one of our upcoming episodes about what's going on with France and with the economic crisis in Lebanon. And they're actually separate from the fact that they're trying to destroy Israel and that Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. There's also the fact that Lebanon itself is imploding.
Yes.
And I was thinking about the fact, like, wow, that's great. Our enemies are, just like, the fact that Syria has disintegrated, it's a terrible human tragedy. But from Israel's security perspective, what was a beast of an enemy on our northern border is a non-entity anymore with Syria. And I was thinking kind of the same thing with Lebanon. Wow, they have so many internal problems going on, and the whole regime is so rickety that maybe this is a good thing because they're kind of weak. And then I thought to myself, wait a second. All that means is that their mindset about timing to attack us could change. That they could have greater desperation on behalf of Hezbollah could actually mean that the fuse to ignite a war is shorter, and that could mean that it's a more dangerous, more volatile situation.
Right. Well, one of the issues is how they view it, and that's something we can never really know from the outside. In other words, do they say, let's be patient, things will get better? Or do they say, this is a closing window, use it or lose it. If we don't do it now, we won't get another chance. And there's no way of knowing from the outside what will actually drive their decision making. Their overall objective is fixed. Destroying Israel is graven in stone. So the question is when and how, and those are things that are very, very difficult to predict. Let me leave you with a sort of a positive note, even if it's
Elliot, ending on something positive is very important.
Okay, so even if it's a positive note that teaches a negative, okay, with all of their planning in 1973, and this works in reverse too, with all of our planning potentially. With all of their planning, the attack on Yom Kippur cost them the war. And we look at it, and again, I read all this stuff, especially.
How so? I don't understand.
So I read the emotional stuff.
You're saying that had the Syrians and Egyptians
attacked on a different day,
not attacked on Yom Kippur,
I don't know if they would have won, but I know that this contributed to their loss.
How so?
Okay, so first of all, we have the emotional approach. It was the holiest day of the year. Everybody was fasting, and yeah, that's true. But let's look at two things, and I'll give you one that was tactical and brief, but very important on the Golan fighting, and one that was sort of grander, and they should have known better in both cases, but they certainly should have known the second one much better. The Arab armies had modern Russian tanks that had night vision equipment. Israel did not have night vision equipment. It gives you another idea. It was out there, it existed, but our tanks did not have night vision. What they had was infrared in those days, state of the art, today, of course, obsolete. When the sun set, the war broke out at 2:00 in the afternoon. When the sun set that evening at about 6:00 or so, 7:00, and it went dark, they had a tremendous advantage, except for one thing. The moon was up. Now, without going into the details, maybe in another lecture, I'll give you the details of how the moon works. Let it be sufficient to say that the night battles were fought on the Golan on the nights of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th of Tishrei.
Full moon.
Approaching a full moon, and the moon was in the sky when the sun set.
Yeah, last night I looked at the moon, it was almost
Right.
full.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. It's about 3/4 moon.
Right,
Because full moon is on the 15th.
right. So from the 10th to
Every
the
month.
15th.
From the
that's
11th.
The 11th, right.
Right? Motzei Yom Kippur, the night
That's
after
right,
Yom
that's right.
So the 11th and on. So it's about a 3/4 moon. I'll tell you something else that you don't know. Nobody knows, but I wrote this in the manual, so I know. The percentage of the moon that's out at night is the percentage of that night that the moon is out.
Ah,
So a 3/4 moon is out 3/4 of the night. A full moon is out all night.
oh,
You
wow.
know that on Rosh Chodesh, the moon is just over the horizon, setting with the sun
It's barely there, right.
on the first of the month. Okay? So not only did they have a bright moon, they had almost a full night's worth of moon. And the part of the night that was dark was the least important part, 4 or 5 in the morning.
So they should have attacked us on Rosh Hashanah.
You got it exactly. Had they attacked on Rosh Hashanah or on Erev Rosh Hashanah, right, the day before Rosh Hashanah, they would have had moonless nights and a tremendous advantage with their night vision.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Okay, and Avigdor Kahalani, who commanded the 77th Battalion, used the moonlight. I won't go into how, that's a whole interesting story, but he used the moonlight to his advantage.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay, so that's one minor error. Major error, minor, it cost them the Golan, but never mind, it was a minor error. The major error is when the war broke out at 2:00 in the afternoon, where was everybody in Israel?
In synagogue.
Pesach, if you're still in synagogue at 2:00 in the afternoon on Yom Kippur, shoot the chazan, shoot the cantor, and get a new one.
Well, no, 2:00 is usually when we're on
Finishing,
Yom
right?
Kippur, we spend the whole day in the synagogue, but usually there's a break of a couple of hours.
Right, but
And it's probably
between,
around, from, 2
Right.
to 4 o'clock.
right, exactly. By 2:00, you know what? The war broke out at 2:30. The system sort of woke up. By
Yeah,
2:30,
everyone's in their break. They're leaving
Everybody's home.
synagogue.
Everybody's home.
For their 1 hour. Put your feet up
Right.
on the couch before going back to the synagogue. Right.
And those who don't go to synagogue have been home all day because there's no place to go.
Right.
Now remember, in 1973, this is a country with no cell phones, no computers, no internet. Most people don't have telephones.
It was very easy to round everyone up.
They knew where everybody was.
Wow.
And all the traffic, and this is what the reserve call up disaster. All of the traffic is going from the population centers out to the reserve mobilization.
And they don't have to deal with any civilian traffic because the roads are empty on Yom Kippur.
That's right. All the traffic
Wow.
in the country.
Fascinating.
Now let me ask you a question. You're not a military expert, but you know a little bit about Israel. What would have happened had they attacked in the intermediate days of Sukkot?
Chaos.
Where would the average Israeli be?
Anywhere, all over the place.
Okay, but
Because
primarily
just for everyone, the intermediate days of Sukkot are days of travel. Everyone is visiting family and visiting national parks and taking their family on a day of vacation somewhere. No one is where they normally are, and it's the worst traffic of the year.
Right. Now, again, go back to 1973. The number of cars in the country is much less. People are traveling by public transportation, and they're going primarily where? To the Sea of Galilee and to Sinai, to the beaches.
That's right.
Now, let me ask you a question. A war breaks out. An average Joe Israeli is at the beach in either place with the wife and a couple of kids. Does he go straight to the army or bring them home first?
That's fascinating. You're right. It's so they thought they were getting us on Yom Kippur. It actually worked to their disadvantage.
It probably cost them 2 days of reserve mess, maybe 3.
Wow, these two insights here about the moon and that are just those are really interesting. Those I've been, I've read a lot of stuff on the Yom Kippur War, and I never
it's not on the
thought
literature
about those. That's fascinating. All right, Elliot, that's all we got for today.
Good.
So this was awesome. We'll see everyone next week. It'll be in the middle of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is generally a very joyous time, a time of celebration. And we will share some thoughts on that as well. And let's see what the news brings us. You never know in 2020.
Absolutely.
God bless you all, and keep praying for Israel.